Section 26 of The Myths of the New World by Daniel J. Brinton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Myths of the New World by Daniel J. Brinton. Chapter 10, Part 1. The Native Priesthood. Thus picking painfully amid the ruins of a race gone to wreck centuries ago, thus rejecting much foreign rubbish and scrutinizing each stone that lies around, if we still are unable to rebuild the edifice in its pristine symmetry and beauty, yet we can at least discern and trace the ground plan and outlines of the fane it raised to God. Before leaving the field to the richer returns of more fortunate workmen, it will not be inappropriate to add a sketch of the ministers of these religions, the servants in this temple. Shamans, conjurers, sorcerers, medicine men, wizards, and many other hard names have been given them, but I shall call them priests, for in their poor way, as well as any other priesthood, they set up to be the agents of the gods, and the interpreters of divinity. No tribe was so devoid of religious sentiment as to be without them. Their power was terrible, and their use of it unscrupulous. Neither men nor gods, death nor life, the winds nor the waves were beyond their control. Like old men of the sea, they have clung to the neck of their nations, throttling all attempts at progress, binding them to the thraldom of superstition and profligacy, dragging them down to wretchedness and death. Christianity and civilization meet in them their most determined, most implacable foes. But what is this but the history of priestcraft and intolerance everywhere, which old Spain can repeat as well as new Spain, the white race as well as the red? Blind leaders of the blind, dupers and duped fall into the ditch. In their own languages, they are variously called by the Algonkins and Dakotas, those knowing divine things and dreamers of the gods. Manitosiu, Wakan Wasipi. In Mexico, masters or guardians of the divine things. Teopixqui, Teotecutli. In Cherokee, their title means possessed of the divine fire. Astilung Kelauhi. In Iroquois, keepers of the faith. Honundiunt. In Quichua, the learned, Amauta. In Maya, the listeners, Kokome. The popular terms in French and English of medicine men is not such a misnomer as might be supposed. The noble science of medicine is connected with divinity, not only by the rudest savage, but the profoundest philosopher, as has been already adverted to. When sickness is looked upon as the effect of the anger of a god, or as the malicious infliction of a sorcerer, it is natural to seek help from those who assume to control the unseen world, and influence the fiats of the Almighty. The recovery from disease is the kindliest exhibition of divine power. Therefore, the earliest canons of medicine in India and Egypt are attributed to no less distinguished authors than the gods Brahma and Thoth. Therefore, the earliest practitioners of the healing art are universally the ministers of religion. But, however creditable this origin is to medicine, its partnership with theology was no particular advantage to it. These mystical doctors shared the contempt still so prevalent among ourselves for a treatment based on experiment and reason, and regarded the administration of emetics and purgatives, baths and diuretics, with a contempt quite equal to that of the disciples of Hamon. The practitioners of the rational school formed a separate class among the Indians, and had nothing to do with amulets, powwows, or spirits. They were of different name and standing, and though held in less estimation, such valuable additions to the pharmacopoeia as Guayacum, Cinchona, and Ipecacuanha were learned from them. The priesthood scorned such ignoble means. Were they summoned to a patient, they drowned his groans in a barbarous clangour of instruments, in order to fright away the demon that possessed him. They sucked and blew upon the diseased organ. They sprinkled him with water, and catching it again threw it on the ground, thus drowning out the disease. They rubbed the part with their hands, and exhibiting a bone or splinter, asserted that they drew it from the body, and that it had been the cause of the malady. They manufactured a little image to represent the spirit of sickness, and spitefully knocked it to pieces, thus vicariously destroying its prototype. They sang doleful and monotonous chants at the top of their voices, screwed their countenances into hideous grimaces, twisted their bodies into unheard-of contortions, and by all accounts did their utmost to merit the honorarium they demanded for their services. A double motive spurred them to spare no pains, for if they failed, not only was their reputation gone, but the next expert called in was likely enough to hint, with that urbanity so traditional in the profession, that the illness was in fact caused or much increased by the antagonistic nature of the remedies previously employed, whereupon the chances were that the doctor's life fell into greater jeopardy than that of his quondam patient. Considering the probable result of this treatment, we may be allowed to doubt whether it redounded on the whole very much to the honour of the fraternity. Their strong points are rather to be looked for in the real knowledge gained by a solitary and reflective life, by an earnest study of the appearances of nature, and of those hints and forest signs which are wholly lost on the white man, and beyond the ordinary insight of a native. Travellers often tell of changes of the weather predicted by them with astonishing foresight, and of information of singular accuracy and extent gleaned from most meagre materials. There is nothing in this to shock our sense of probability, much to elevate our opinion of the natives' sagacity. They were also adepts in tricks of sleight of hand, and had no mean acquaintance with what is called natural magic. They would allow themselves to be tied hand and foot with knots innumerable, and at a sign would shake them loose as so many wisps of straw. They would spit fire and swallow hot coals, pick glowing stones from the flames, and walk naked through a fire, and plunge their arms to the shoulder in kettles of boiling water, would spit fire and swallow hot coals, pick glowing stones from the flames, walk naked through a fire, and plunge knives into vital parts, vomit blood, or kill one another out and out to all appearances, and yet in a few minutes be as well as ever. They could set fire to articles of clothing, and even houses, and by a touch of their magic restore them instantly as perfect as before. If it were not within our power to see most of these miracles performed any night in one of our great cities by a well-dressed professional, we would at once deny their possibility. As it is, they astonish us only too little. One of the most peculiar and characteristic exhibitions of their power was to summon a spirit to answer inquiries concerning the future and the absent. A great similarity marked this proceeding in all northern tribes, from the Eskimos to the Mexicans. A circular or conical lodge of stout poles, 4 or 8 in number, planted firmly in the ground, was covered with skins or mats, a small aperture only being left for the seer to enter. Once in, he carefully closed the hole, and commenced his incantations. Soon the lodge trembles, the strong poles shake and bend as with the united strength of a dozen men, and strange unearthly sounds, now far aloft in the air, now deep in the ground, anon approaching near and nearer, reach the ears of the spectators. At length the priest announces that the spirit is present, and is prepared to answer questions. An indispensable preliminary to any inquiry is to insert a handful of tobacco, or a string of beads, or some such douceur under the skins, ostensibly for the behoof of the celestial visitor, who would seem not to be above earthly wants and vanities. The replies received, though occasionally singularly clear and correct, are usually of that profoundly ambiguous purport which leaves the anxious inquirer little wiser than he was before. For all this, ventriloquism, trickery, and shrewd knavery are sufficient explanations, nor does it materially interfere with this view that converted Indians, on whose veracity we can implicitly rely, have repeatedly averred that in performing this rite they themselves did not move the medicine lodge, for nothing is easier than in the state of nervous excitement they were then in to be self-deceived, as the now familiar phenomenon of table-turning illustrates. But there is something more than these vulgar arts now and then to be perceived. There are statements supported by unquestionable testimony which ought not to be passed over in silence, and yet I cannot but approach them with hesitation. They are so revolting to the laws of exact science, so alien, I had almost said, to the experience of our lives. Yet is this true, or are such experiences only ignored and put aside without serious consideration? Are there not in the history of each of us passages which strike our retrospective thought with awe, almost with terror? Are there not in nearly every community individuals who possess a mysterious power, concerning whose origin, mode of action, and limits we and they are alike in the dark? I refer to such organic forces as are popularly summed up under the words clairvoyance, mesmerism, rhabdomancy, animal magnetism, physical spiritualism. Civilized thousands stake their faith and hope here and thereafter on the truths of these manifestations. Rational medicine recognizes their existence, and while it attributes them to morbid and exceptional influences, confesses its want of more exact knowledge, and refrains from barren theorizing. Let us follow her example, and hold it enough to show that such powers, whatever they are, were known to the native priesthood as well as the modern spiritualists and the miracle mongers of the Middle Ages. Their highest development is what our ancestors called second sight. That under certain conditions knowledge can pass from one mind to another otherwise than through the ordinary channels of the senses is familiarly shown by the examples of persons en rapport. The limit to this we do not know, but it is not unlikely that clairvoyance or second sight is based upon it. In his autobiography, the celebrated Sac chief Black Hawk relates that his great-grandfather was inspired by a belief that at the end of 4 years he should see a white man who would be to him a father. Under the direction of this vision he travelled eastward to a certain spot, and there, as he was forewarned, met a Frenchman, through whom the nation was brought into alliance with France. No one at all versed in the Indian character will doubt the implicit faith with which this legend was told and heard, but we may be pardoned our scepticism, seeing there are so many chances of error. It is not so with an anecdote related by Captain Jonathan Carver, a cool-headed English trader, whose little book of travels is an unquestioned authority. In 1767 he was among the Quilistanos at a time when they were in great straits for food, and depending upon the arrival of the traders to rescue them from starvation. They persuaded the chief priest to consult the divinities as to when the relief would arrive. After the usual preliminaries, this magnate announced that next day, precisely when the sun reached the zenith, a canoe would arrive with further tidings. At the appointed hour the whole village, together with the incredulous Englishman, was on the beach, and sure enough, at the minute specified, a canoe swung round a distant point of land, and rapidly approaching the shore, brought the expected news. Charlevoix is nearly as trustworthy a writer as Carver, yet he deliberately relates an equally singular instance. But these examples are surpassed by one described in the Atlantic Monthly of July 1866, the author of which, John Mason Brown, Esquire, has assured me of its accuracy in every particular. Some years since, at the head of a party of voyagers, he set forth in search of a band of Indians somewhere on the vast plains along the tributaries of the Coppermine and Mackenzie rivers. Danger, disappointment, and the fatigues of the road induced one after another to turn back, until of the original 10 only 3 remained. They also were on the point of giving up the apparently hopeless quest, when they were met by some warriors of the very band they were seeking. These had been sent out by one of their medicine men to find 3 whites whose horses, arms, attire, and personal appearance he minutely described, which description was repeated to Mr. Brown by the warriors before they saw his 2 companions. When afterwards the priest, a frank and simple-minded man, was asked to explain this extraordinary occurrence, he could offer no other explanation than that he saw them coming, and heard them talk on their journey. End of section 26. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Section 27 of The Myths of the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Myths of the New World by Daniel Brinton. Chapter 10. Part 2. Many tales such as these have been recorded by travellers, and however much they may shock our sense of probability, as well authenticated exhibitions of a power which sways the Indian mind, and which has ever prejudiced it so unchangeably against Christianity and civilization, they cannot be disregarded. Whether they too are but specimens of refined knavery, whether they are instigations of the devil, or whether they must be classed with other facts as illustrating certain obscure and curious mental faculties, each may decide as the bent of his mind inclines him, for science makes no decision. Those nervous conditions associated with the name of mesmer were nothing new to the Indian magicians. Rubbing and stroking the sick, and laying on of hands were very common parts of their clinical procedures, and at the initiations to their societies they were frequently exhibited. Observers have related that among the Nez Perces of Oregon, the novice was put to sleep by songs, incantations, and certain passes of the hand, and that with the Dakotas he would be struck lightly on the breast at a preconcerted moment, and instantly would drop prostrate on his face, his muscles rigid and quivering in every fibre. There is no occasion to suppose deceit in this. It finds its parallel in every race and every age, and rests on a characteristic trait of certain epochs and certain men, which leads them to seek the divine, not in thoughtful contemplation on the laws of the universe and the facts of self-consciousness, but in an entire immolation of the latter, a sinking of their own individuality in that of the spirits whose alliance they seek. This is an outgrowth of that ignoring of the universality of law which belongs to the lower stages of enlightenment. And as this is never done with impunity, but with iron certainty brings its punishment with it, the study of the mental conditions thus evoked, and the results which follow them, offer a salutary subject of reflection to the theologian as well as the physician. For these examples of nervous pathology are identical in kind and alike in consequences, whether witnessed in the primitive forests of the New World, among the convulsionists of St. Medard, or in the excited scenes of a religious revival in one of our own churches. Sleeplessness and abstemiousness carried to the utmost verge of human endurance, seclusion and the pertinacious fixing of the mind on one subject, obstinate gloating on some morbid fancy, rarely failed to bring about hallucinations with all the garb of reality. Physicians are well aware that the more frequently these diseased conditions of the mind are sought, the more readily they are found. Then again, they were often induced by intoxicating and narcotic herbs. Tobacco, the maguey, coca, in California the chucuaco, among the Mexicans the snake plant olinhiqui or coaxihuitl, and among the southern tribes of our own country the cassin upon and iris versicolor were used, and, it is even said, were cultivated for this purpose. The seer must work himself up to a prophetic fury, or, speechless, lie in apparent death, before the mind of the gods would be opened to him. Trance and ecstasy were the two avenues he knew to divinity, fasting and seclusion the means employed to discover them. His ideal was of a prophet who dwelt afar from men, without need of food, fasting, in constant communion with divinity,
Such an one, in the legends of the Tupis, resided on a mountain glittering with gold and silver, near the river Uape, his only companion a dog, his only occupation dreaming of the gods. When, however, an eclipse was near, his dog would bark, and then, taking the form of a bird, he would fly over the villages and learn the changes that had taken place. But man cannot trample with impunity on the laws of his physical life, and the consequences of these deprivations and morbid excitements of the brain show themselves in terrible pictures. Not unfrequently they were carried to the pitch of raving mania, reminding one of the worst forms of the berserker fury of the Scandinavians or the Bacchic rage of Greece. The enthusiast, maddened with the fancies of a disordered intellect, would start forth from his seclusion in an access of demoniac frenzy. Then woe to the dog, the child, the slave, or the woman who crossed his path, for nothing but blood could satisfy his inappeasable craving, and they fell instant victims to his madness. But were it a strong man, he bared his arm and let the frenzied hermit bury his teeth in the quivering flesh. Such is a scene at this day not uncommon on the northwest coast, and few of the natives around Millbank Sound are without the scars the result of this horrid custom. This frenzy, terrible enough in individuals, had its most disastrous effects when, with that peculiar facility of contagion which marks hysterical maladies, it swept through whole villages, transforming them into bedlams filled with unrestrained madmen. Those who have studied the strange and terrible mental epidemics that visited Europe in the Middle Ages, such as the tarantula dance of Apulia, the Chorea Germanorum, and the great St. Vitus's dance, will be prepared to appreciate the nature of a scene at a Huron village described by Father Lejeune in 1639. A festival of 3 days and 3 nights had been in progress to relieve a woman who, from the description, seemed to have been suffering from some obscure nervous complaint. Toward the close of this vigil, which throughout was marked by all sorts of debaucheries and excesses, all the participants seemed suddenly seized by 10,000 devils. They ran howling and shrieking through the town, breaking everything destructible in the cabins, killing dogs, beating the women and children, tearing their garments, and scattering the fires in every direction with bare hands and feet. Some of them dropped senseless, to remain long or permanently insane, but the others continued until worn out with exhaustion. The father learned that during these orgies not unfrequently whole villages were consumed, and the total extirpation of some families had resulted. No wonder that he saw in them the diabolical workings of the prince of evil, but the physician is rather inclined to class them with those cases of epidemic hysteria, the common products of violent and ill-directed mental stimuli. These various considerations prove beyond a doubt that the power of the priesthood did by no means rest exclusively on deception. They endorse and explain the assertions of converted natives that their power as prophets was something real and entirely inexplicable to themselves. And they make it easily understood how those missionaries failed who attempted to persuade them that all this boasted power was false. More correct views than these ought to have been suggested by the facts themselves, for it is indisputable that these magicians did not hesitate at times to test their strength on each other. In these strange duels à l'outrance, one would be seated opposite his antagonist, surrounded with the mysterious emblems of his craft, and call upon his gods one after another to strike his enemy dead. Sometimes one, gathering his medicine as it was termed, feeling within himself that hidden force of will which makes itself acknowledged even without words, would rise in his might, and in a loud and severe voice command his opponents to die. Straightway the latter would drop dead, or, yielding in craven fear to a superior volition, forsake the implements of his art, and with an awful terror at his heart creep to his lodge, refuse all nourishment, and presently perish. Still more terrible was the tyranny they exerted on the superstitious minds of the masses. Let an Indian once be possessed of the idea that he is bewitched, and he will probably reject all food, and sink under the phantoms of his own fancy. How deep the superstitious veneration of these men has struck its roots in the soul of the Indian, it is difficult for civilized minds to conceive. Their power is currently supposed to be without any bounds, extending to the raising of the dead and the control of all laws of nature. The grave offers no escape from their omnipotent arms. The Sacs and Foxes, Algonquin tribes, think that the soul cannot leave the corpse until set free by the medicine men at their great annual feast, and the Puelches of Buenos Aires guard a profound silence as they pass by the tomb of some redoubted necromancer, lest they should disturb his repose and suffer from his malignant skill. While thus investigating their real and supposed power over the physical and mental world, their strictly priestly functions, as performers of the rites of religion, have not been touched upon. Among the ruder tribes these, indeed, were of the most rudimentary character. Sacrifices, chiefly in the form of feasts, where every one crammed to his utmost, dances, often winding up with the wildest scenes of licentiousness, the repetition of long and monotonous chants, the making of the new fire, these are the ceremonies that satisfy the religious wants of savages. The priest finds a further sphere for his activity in manufacturing and consecrating amulets to keep off ill luck, in interpreting dreams, and especially in lifting the veil of the future. In Peru, for example, they were divided into classes which made the various means of divination specialties. Some caused the idols to speak, others derived their foreknowledge from words spoken by the dead, others predicted by leaves of tobacco or the grains and juice of cocoa, while to still other classes the shapes of grains of maize taken at random, the appearance of animal excrement, the forms assumed by the smoke rising from burning victims, the entrails and viscera of animals, the course taken by a certain species of spider, the visions seen in drunkenness, the flights of birds, and the direction in which fruits would fall, all offered so many separate fields of prognostication, the professors of which were distinguished by different ranks and titles. As the intellectual force of the nation was chiefly centred in this class, they became the acknowledged depositaries of its sacred legends, the instructors in the art of preserving thought, and from their duty to regulate festivals sprang the observation of the motions of the heavenly bodies, the adjustment of the calendars, and the pseudo-science of judicial astrology. The latter was carried to as subtle a pitch of refinement in Mexico as in the Old World, and large portions of the ancient writers are taken up with explaining the method adopted by the native astrologers to cast the horoscope and reckon the nativity of the newly born infant. How was this superior power obtained? What were the terms of admission to this privileged class? In the ruler communities the power was strictly personal. It was revealed to its possessor by the character of the visions he perceived at the ordeal he passed through on arriving at puberty, and by the northern nations was said to be the manifestation of a more potent personal spirit than ordinary. It was not a faculty, but an inspiration, not an inborn strength, but a spiritual gift. The curious theory of the Dakotas, as recorded by the Reverend Mr. Pond, was that the necromant first wakes to consciousness as a winged seed, wafted hither and thither by the intelligent action of the four winds. In this form he visits the homes of the different classes of divinities, and learns the chants, feasts, and dances which it is proper for the human race to observe, the art of omnipresence or clairvoyance, the means of inflicting and healing diseases, and the occult secrets of nature, man, and divinity. This is called dreaming of the gods. When this instruction is completed, the seed enters one about to become a mother, assumes human form, and in due time manifests his power. 4 such incarnations awaited, each of increasing might, and then the spirit returns to its original nothingness. The same necessity of death and resurrection was entertained by the Eskimos. To become of the highest order of priests, it was supposed requisite, says Bishop Egede, that one of the lower order should be drowned and eaten by sea monsters. Then, when his bones, one after another, were all washed ashore, his spirit, which meanwhile had been learning the secrets of the invisible world, would return to them, and clothed in flesh he would go back to his tribe. At other times a vague and indescribable longing seizes a young person, a morbid appetite possesses them, or they fall a prey to an inappeasable and aimless restlessness, or a causeless melancholy. These signs the old priests recognize as the expression of a personal spirit of the higher order. They take charge of the youth and educate him to the mysteries of their craft. For months or years he is condemned to entire seclusion, receiving no visits but from the brethren of his order. At length he is initiated with ceremonies of more or less pomp into the brotherhood, and from that time assumes that gravity of demeanour, sententious style of expression, and general air of mystery and importance, everywhere deemed so eminently becoming in a doctor and a priest. A peculiarity of the Moxos was that they thought none designated for the office but such as had escaped from the claws of the South American tiger, which, indeed, it is said, they worshipped as a god. Occasionally, in very uncultivated tribes, some family or totem claimed a monopoly of the priesthood. Thus, among the Nez Perces of Oregon, it was transmitted in one family from father to son and daughter, but always with the proviso that the children at the proper age reported dreams of a satisfactory character. Perhaps alone of the Algonquin tribes the Shawnees confined it to one totem, but it is remarkable that the greatest of their prophets, Elskatawe, brother of Tecumseh, was not a member of this clan. From the most remote times the Cherokees have had one family set apart for the priestly office. This was when first known to the whites, that of the Nicotani, but its members, puffed up with pride and insolence, abused their birthright so shamefully, and prostituted it so flagrantly to their own advantage, that with savage justice they were massacred to the last man. Another was appointed in their place, who to this day officiates in all religious rites. They have, however, the superstition, possibly borrowed from Europeans, that the seventh son is a natural-born prophet with the gift of healing by touch. Adair states that their former neighbours, the Choctaws, permitted the office of high priest or great beloved man to remain in one family, passing from father to eldest son, and the very influential Piaches of the Carib tribes very generally transmitted their rank and position to their children. In the ancient Anahuac, the prelacy was as systematic and its rules as well defined as in the Church of Rome, except those in the service of Huitzilopochtli and perhaps a few other gods. None obtained the priestly office by right of descent, but were dedicated to it from early childhood. Their education was completed at the Kalmikak, a sort of ecclesiastical college, where instruction was given in all the wisdom of the ancients and the esoteric lore of their craft. The art of mixing colours and tracing designs, the ideographic writing and phonetic hieroglyphs, the songs and prayers used in public worship, the national traditions of the principles of astrology, the hidden meaning of symbols, and the use of musical instruments, all formed parts of the really extensive course of instruction that they received. When they manifested a satisfactory acquaintance with this curriculum, they were appointed by their superiors to such positions as their natural talents and the use they had made of them qualified them for, some to instruct children, others to the service of the temples, and others again to take charge of what we may call country parishes. Implicit subordination of all to the high priest of Huitzilopochtli, hereditary Pontifex Maximus, chastity, or at least temperate indulgence in pleasure, gravity of carriage, and strict attention to duty, were laws laid upon all. The state religion of Peru was conducted under the supervision of a high priest of the Inca family, and its ministers, as in Mexico, could be of either sex, and hold office either by inheritance, education, or election. For political reasons, the most important posts were usually enjoyed by relatives of the ruler, but this was usage, not law. It is stated by Garcilaso de la Vega that they served in the temples by turns, each being on duty the fourth of a lunar month at a time. Were this substantiated, it would offer the only example of the regulation of public life by a week of 7 days to be found in the New World. In every country There is perceptible a desire in this class of men to surround themselves with mystery, and to concentrate and increase their power by forming an intimate alliance among themselves. They affected singularity in dress and a professional costume. Bartram describes the junior priests of the Creeks as dressed in white robes, and carrying on their head or arm a great owl skin stuffed very ingeniously, and an insignia of wisdom and divination. These bachelors are also distinguishable from other people by their taciturnity, grave and solemn countenance, dignified step, and singing to themselves songs or hymns in a low sweet voice as they stroll about the towns. The priests of the civilized nations adopted various modes of dress to typify the divinity which they served, and their appearance was often in the highest degree unprepossessing. To add to their self-importance, they pretended to converse in a tongue different from that used in ordinary life, and the chants containing the prayers and legends were often in this esoteric dialect. Fragments of one or two of these have floated down to us from the Aztec priesthood. The travellers Balboa and Correal mention that the temple services of Peru were conducted in a language not understood by the masses, and the incantations of the priests of the Powhatan were not in ordinary Algonquin, but some obscure jargon. The same peculiarity has been observed among the Dakotas and Eskimos, and in these nations, fortunately, it fell under the notice of competent linguistic scholars who have submitted it to a searching examination. The results of their labours prove that certainly in these two instances the supposed foreign tongues were nothing more than the ordinary dialects of the country modified by an affected accentuation, by the introduction of a few cabalistic terms, and by the use of descriptive circumlocutions and figurative words in place of ordinary expressions, a slang, in short, such as rascals and pedants invariably coin whenever they associate. All these stratagems were intended to shroud with impenetrable secrecy the mysteries of the brotherhood. With the same motive, the priests formed societies of different grades of illumination, only to be entered by those willing to undergo trying ordeals, whose secrets were not to be revealed under the severest penalties. The Algonkins had three such grades, the Waubeno, the Meda, and the Josaquid, the last being the highest. To this no white man was ever admitted. All tribes appear to have been controlled by these secret societies. Alexander von Humboldt mentions one, called that of the Botuto or Holy Trumpet, among the Indians of the Orinoco, whose members must vow celibacy and submit to severe scourgings and fasts. The Colahuayas of Peru were a guild of itinerant quacks and magicians who never remained permanently in one spot. Withal, there was no class of persons who so widely and deeply influenced the culture and shaped the destiny of the Indian tribes as their priests. In attempting to gain a true conception of the race's capacities and history, there is no one element of their social life which demands closer attention than the power of these teachers. Hitherto, they have been spoken of with a contempt which I hope this chapter shows is unjustifiable. However much we may deplore the use they made of their skill, we must estimate it fairly and grant it its due weight in measuring the influence of the religious sentiment on the history of man. End of section 27. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.
Section 28 of the Myths of the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. The Myths of the New World by Daniel Brinton. Chapter 11, Part 1. The Influence of the Native Religions on the Moral and Social Life of the Race. Natural religions hitherto considered of evil rather than of good. Distinctions to be drawn. Morality not derived from religion. The positive side of natural religions and incarnations of divinity. Examples: prayers as indices of religious progress, religion and social advancement, conclusion. Drawing toward the conclusion of my essay, I am sensible that the vast field of American mythology remains for most part untouched, that I have but proof that it is not an absolute wilderness, pathless as the tropical jungles which now conceal the temples of the race, but that, go where we will, certain landmarks and guideposts are visible, revealing uniformity of design and purpose, and refuting by their presence the oft-repeated charge of entire incoherence and aimlessness. It remains to examine the subjective power of the native religions, their influence on those who held them, and the place they deserve in the history of the race. What are their merits, if merits they have? What their demerits? Did they purify the life and enlighten the mind, or the contrary? Are they in short of evil or of good? The problem is complex, its solution most difficult. The author who of late years has studied most profoundly the savage races of the globe expresses the discouraging conviction, their religions have not acted as levers to raise them to civilization. They have rather worked, and that powerfully, to impede every step in advance, in the first place, by ascribing everything unintelligible in nature to spiritual agency, and then by making the fate of man dependent on mysterious and capricious forces, not on his own skill and foresight. It would ill accord with the theory of mythology, which I have all along maintained, if this verdict were final. But in fact these false doctrines brought with them their own antidotes, at least to some extent, and while we give full weight to their evil, let us also acknowledge their good, by substituting direct divine interference for law, belief for knowledge, a dogma for a fact. The highest stimulus to mental endeavor was taken away. Nature, to the heathen, is no harmonious whole swayed by eternal principles, but a chaos of causeless effects, the meaningless play of capricious ghosts. He investigates not because he doubts not. All events are to him miracles. Therefore his faith knows no bounds, and those who teach that doubt is sinful must contemplate him with admiration. The damsels of Nicaragua, destined to be thrown into the seething craters of volcanoes, went to their fate, says Pascual de Andagoya, happy as if they were going to be saved, and doubtless believing so. The subjects of a Central American chieftain, remarks Oviedo, look upon it as the crown of favors to be permitted to die with their cacique, and thus to acquire immortality. The terrible power exerted by the priests rested, as they themselves often saw, largely on the implicit and literal acceptance of their dicta. In some respects the contrast here offered to enlightened nations is not always in favor of the latter. Borrowing the pointed antithesis of the poet, the mind is often tempted to exclaim, "This is all the gain we reap from all the wisdom sown through ages. Nothing doubted those first sons of time, while we, the schooled of centuries, nothing believe." But the complaint is unfounded. Faith is dearly bought at the cost of knowledge, nor in a better sense has it yet gone from among us. Far more sublime than any known to the barbarian is the faith of the astronomer, who spends the nights in marking the seemingly wayward motions of the stars, or of the anatomist, who studies with unwearied zeal the minute fibres of the organism, each upheld by the unshaken conviction that from least to greatest throughout this universe, purpose and order everywhere prevail. Natural religions rarely offer more than this negative opposition to reason. They are tolerant to a degree. The savage, void of any clear conception of a supreme deity, sets up no claim that his is the only true church. If he is conquered in battle, he imagines that it is owing to the inferiority of his own gods to those of his victor, and he rarely, therefore, requires any other reasons to make him a convert. Acting on this principle, the Incas, when they overcame a strange province, sent its most venerated idol for a time to the temple of the sun at Cuzco, thus proving its inferiority to their own divinity, but took no more violent steps to propagate their creeds. So in the city of Mexico there was a temple appropriated to the idols of conquered nations, in which they were shut up, both to prove their weakness and prevent them from doing mischief. A nation, like an individual, was not inclined to patronize a deity who had manifested his incompetence by allowing his charge to be gradually worn away by constant disaster. As far as can now be seen, in matters intellectual, the religions of ancient Mexico and Peru were far more liberal than that introduced by the Spanish conquerors, which, claiming the monopoly of truth, sought to enforce its claim by inquisitions and censorships. In this view of the relative powers of deities lay a potent corrective to the doctrine that the fate of man was dependent on the caprices of the gods, for no belief was more universal than that which assigned to each individual a guardian spirit. This invisible monitor was an ever-present help in trouble. He suggested expedients, gave advice and warning in dreams, protected in danger, and stood ready to foil the machinations of enemies, divine or human. With unlimited faith in this protector, attributing to him the devices suggested by his own quick wits and the fortunate chances of life, the savage escaped the oppressive thought that he was the slave of demoniac forces, and dared the dangers of the forest and the war-path without anxiety. By far the darkest side of such a religion is that which it presents to morality. The religious sense is by no means the voice of conscience. The Tecali Indian, when sick, makes a full and free confession of sins, but a murder, however unnatural and unprovoked, he does not mention, not counting it crime. Scenes of brutal licentiousness were approved and sustained throughout the continent as acts of worship. Maidenhood was in many parts freely offered up or claimed by the priests as a right. In Central America, twins were slain for religious motives. Human sacrifice was common throughout the tropics, and was not unusual in higher latitudes. Cannibalism was often enjoined, and in Peru, Florida, and Central America it was not uncommon for parents to slay their own children at the behest of a priest. The philosophical moralist contemplating such spectacles has thought to recognize in them one consoling trait. All history, it has been said, shows man living under an irritated God, and seeking to appease him by sacrifice of blood. The essence of all religion, it has been added, lies in that of which sacrifice is the symbol, namely in the offering up of self, in the rendering up of our will to the will of God. But sacrifice, when not a token of gratitude, cannot be thus explained. It is not a rendering up, but a substitution of our will for God's will. A deity is angered by neglect of his dues. He will revenge, certainly, terribly, we know not how or when. But as punishment is all he desires, if we punish ourselves he will be satisfied. And far better is such self-inflicted torture than a fearful looking for of judgment to come. Craven fear, not without some dim sense of the implacability of nature's laws, is at its root. Looking only at this side of religion, the ancient philosopher averred that the gods existed solely in the apprehensions of their votaries, and the moderns have asserted that fear is the father of religion, love her late-born daughter, that the first form of religious belief is nothing else but a horror of the unknown, and that no natural religion appears to have been able to develop from a germ within itself anything whatever of real advantage to civilization. Far be it from me to excuse the enormities thus committed under the garb of religion, or to ignore their disastrous consequences on human progress. Yet this question is a fair one. If the natural religious belief has in it no germ of anything better, whence comes the manifest and undeniable improvement occasionally witnessed, as for example among the Toltecs, the Peruvians, and the Mayas? The reply is, by the influence of great men who cultivated within themselves a purer faith, lived it in their lives, preached it successfully to their fellows, and at their death still survived in the memory of their nation unforgotten models of noble qualities. Where in America is any record of such men? We are pointed in answer to Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, Zamna, and their congeners. But these august figures I have shown to be wholly mythical, creations of the religious fancy, parts and parcels of the earliest religion itself. The entire theory falls to nothing, therefore, and we discover a positive side to natural religions, one that conceals a germ of endless progress, which vindicates their lofty origin, and proves that He is not far from every one of us. I have already analyzed these figures under their physical aspect. Let it be observed in what antithesis they stand to most other mythological creations. Let it be remembered that they primarily correspond to the stable, the regular, the cosmical phenomena, that they are always conceived under human form, not as giants, fairies, or strange beasts, that they were said at one time to have been visible leaders of their nations, that they did not suffer death, and that, though absent, they are ever present, favoring those who remain mindful of their precepts. I touched but incidentally on their moral aspects. This was likewise in contrast to the majority of inferior deities. The worship of the latter was a tribute extorted by fear. The Indian deposits tobacco on the rocks of a rapid, that the spirit of the swift waters may not swallow his canoe. In a storm he throws overboard a dog to appease the siren of the angry waves. He used to tear the hearts from his captives to gain the favor of the god of war. He provides himself with talismans to bind hostile deities. He fees the conjurer to exorcise the demon of disease. He loves none of them, he respects none of them. He only fears their wayward tempers. They are to him mysterious, invisible, capricious goblins. But in his highest divinity he recognized a father and a preserver, a benign intelligence who provided for him the comforts of life, man like himself, yet a god, God of all. Go and do good was the parting injunction of his father to Machabo in Algonquin legend, and in their ancient and uncorrupted stories such is ever his object. The worship of Temu, the culture hero of the Guaranis, says the traveller d'Orbigny, is one of reverence, not of fear. They were ideals, summing up in themselves the best traits, the most approved virtues of whole nations, and were adored in a very different spirit from other divinities. None of them has more humane and elevated traits than Quetzalcoatl. He was represented of majestic stature and dignified demeanor. In his train came skilled artificers and men of learning. He was chaste and temperate in life, wise in counsel, generous of gifts, conquering rather by arts of peace than of war, delighting in music, flowers, and brilliant colors, and so averse to human sacrifices that he shut his ears with both hands when they were even mentioned. Such was the ideal man and supreme god of a people who even a Spanish monk of the 16th century felt constrained to confess were a good people, attached to virtue, urbane and simple in social intercourse, shunning lies, skilful in arts, pious toward their gods. Is it likely, is it possible, that with such a model as this before their minds they received no benefit from it? Was not this a lever, and a mighty one, lifting the race towards civilization and a purer faith? End of section 28. Recording by Pamela Krantz. Section 29 of the Myths of the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. The Myths of the New World by Daniel Brinton. Chapter 11, Part 2. Transfer the field of observation to Yucatan, and we find in Zamna to New Granada, and in Nemcateba to Peru, and in Viracocha, or his reflex Manco Capac, the lineaments of Quetzalcoatl, modified indeed by difference of blood and temperament, but each combining in himself all the qualities most esteemed by their several nations. Were one or all of these proved to be historical personages, still the fact remains that the primitive religious sentiment, investing them with the best attributes of humanity, dwelling on them as its models, worshipping them as gods, contained a kernel of truth potent to encourage moral excellence. But if they were mythical, then this truth was of spontaneous growth, self-developed by the growing distinctness of the idea of God, a living witness that the religious sense, like every other faculty, has within itself a power of endless evolution. If we inquire the secret of the happier influence of this element in natural worship, it is all contained in one word, its humanity. The ideal of morality, says the contemplative Novalis, has no more dangerous rival than the ideal of the greatest strength, of the most vigorous life, the brute ideal, das Tierideal. Culture advances in proportion as man recognizes what faculties are peculiar to him as man, and devotes himself to their education. The moral value of religions can be very precisely estimated by the human or the brutal character of their gods. The worship of Quetzalcoatl in the city of Mexico was subordinate to that of lower conceptions, and consequently the more sanguinary and immoral were the rites there practised. The Algonkins, who knew no other meaning for Machabo than the great hare, had lost by a false etymology the best part of their religion. Looking around for other standards wherewith to measure the progress of the knowledge of divinity in the New World, prayer suggests itself as one of the least deceptive. Prayer, to quote again the words of Novalis, is in religion what thought is in philosophy. The religious sense prays as the reason thinks. Guizot, carrying the analysis farther, thinks that it is prompted by a painful conviction of the inability of our will to conform to the dictates of reason. Originally it was connected with the belief that divine caprice, not divine law, governs the universe, and that material benefits rather than spiritual gifts are to be desired. The gradual recognition of its limitations and proper objects marks religious advancement. The Lord's Prayer contains 7 petitions, only one of which is for a temporal advantage, and it the least that can be asked for. What immeasurable interval between it and the prayer of the Nootka Indian on preparing for war! Great Quahutse, let me live, not be sick, find the enemy, not fear him, find him asleep, and kill a great many of him. Or again between it and the petition of a Huron to a local god, heard by Father Brebeuf. Oki, thou who livest in this spot, I offer thee tobacco. Help us, save us from shipwreck, defend us from our enemies, give us a good trade, and bring us back safe and sound to our villages. This is a fair specimen of the supplications of the lowest religion. Another equally authentic is given by Father Alloway. In 1670 he penetrated to an outlying Algonquin village, never before visited by a white man. The inhabitants, startled by his pale face and long black gown, took him for a divinity. They invited him to the council lodge. A circle of old men gathered around him, and one of them, approaching him with a double handful of tobacco, thus addressed him, the others grunting approval. This indeed is well, Black Robe, that thou dost visit us. Have mercy upon us, thou art a Manito, we give thee to smoke. The Naudowessies and Iroquois are devouring us. Have mercy upon us. We are often sick, our children die, we are hungry. Have mercy upon us. Hear me, O Manito, I give thee to smoke. Let the earth yield us corn, the rivers give us fish. Sickness not slay us, nor hunger so torment us. Hear us, O Manito, we give thee to smoke. In this rude but touching petition, wrung from the heart of a miserable people, nothing but the wretchedness is visible. Not the faintest trace of an aspiration for spiritual enlightenment cheers the eye of the philanthropist. Not the remotest conception that through suffering we are purified can be detected. By the side of these examples we may place the prayers of Peru and Mexico. forms composed by the priests, written out, committed to memory, and repeated at certain seasons. They are not less authentic, having been collected and translated in the first generation after the conquest. One to Viracocha Pachacamac was as follows: O Pachacamac, thou who hast existed from the beginning and shalt exist unto the end, powerful and pitiful, who createdst man by saying, Let man be, who defendest us from evil and preservest our life and health, art thou in the sky or in the earth, in the clouds or in the depths? Hear the voice of him who implores thee, and grant him his petitions. Give us life everlasting, preserve us, and accept this our sacrifice. In the voluminous specimens of Aztec prayers preserved by Sahagun, moral improvement, the spiritual gift, is very rarely, if at all, the object desired. Health, harvests, propitious rains, release from pain, preservation from dangers, illness, and defeat, these are the almost unvarying themes. But here and there we catch a glimpse of something better, some dim sense of the divine beauty of suffering, some feeble glimmering of the grand truth so nobly expressed by the poet: O Dabusens tiefer der stromt Gedeihn der festen Duldung unentschlossner Zet. Nicht Schmerz ist Unglück, Glück nicht immer Freude, wie sinnige Geschick Wut dem Bida. Is it possible, says one of them, that this scourge, this affliction, is sent to us not for our correction and improvement, but for our destruction and annihilation? O merciful Lord, let this chastisement with which thou hast visited us, thy people, be as those which a father or mother inflicts on their children, not out of anger, but to the end that they may be free from follies and vices. Another formula, used when a chief was elected to some important position, reads: O Lord, open his eyes and give him light, sharpen his ears and give him understanding, not that he may use them to his own advantage, but for the good of the people he rules. Lead him to know and to do thy will. Let him be as a trumpet which sounds thy words. Keep him from the commission of injustice and oppression. At first, good and evil are identical with pleasure and pain, luck and ill luck. The good are good warriors and hunters, set upon each chief, which would also be the opinion of a wolf, if he could express it. Gradually the eyes of the mind are opened, and it is perceived that whom he loveth he chastiseth, and physical give place to moral ideas of good and evil. Finally, as the idea of God rises more distinctly before the soul, as the one by whom, in whom, and through whom all things are, evil is seen to be the negation, not the opposite of good, and itself a porch oft opening on the sun. The influence of these religions on art, science, and social life must also be weighed in estimating their value. Nearly all the remains of American plastic art, sculpture, and painting were obviously designed for religious purposes. Idols of stone, wood, or baked clay were found in every Indian tribe, without exception, so far as I can judge, and in only a few directions do these arts seem to have been applied to secular purposes. The most ambitious attempts of architecture, it is plain, were inspired by religious fervor. The Great Pyramid of Cholula, the enormous mounds of the Mississippi Valley, the elaborate edifices on artificial hills in Yucatan were miniature representations of the mountains hallowed by tradition, the hill of heaven, the peak on which their ancestors escaped in the flood, or that in the terrestrial paradise from which flow the rains. Their construction took men away from war and the chase, encouraged agriculture, peace, and a settled disposition, and fostered the love of property, of country, and of the gods. The priests were also close observers of nature, and were the first to discover its simpler laws. The Aztec sages were as devoted stargazers as the Chaldeans, and their calendar bears unmistakable marks of native growth, and of its original purpose to fix the annual festivals. Writing by means of pictures and symbols was cultivated chiefly for religious ends, and the word hieroglyph is a witness that the phonetic alphabet was discovered under the stimulus of the religious sentiment. Most of the aboriginal literature was composed and taught by the priests, and most of it refers to matters connected with their superstitions. As the gifts of votaries and the erection of temples enriched the sacerdotal order individually and collectively, the terrors of religion were lent to the secular arm to enforce the rights of property. Music, poetic, scenic, and historical recitations formed parts of the ceremonies of the more civilized nations, and national unity was strengthened by a common shrine. An active barter in amulets, lucky stones, and charms existed all over the continent, to a much greater extent than we might think. As experience demonstrates that nothing so efficiently promotes civilization as the free and peaceful intercourse of man with man, I lay particular stress on the common custom of making pilgrimages. The temple on the island of Cozumel in Yucatan was visited every year by such multitudes from all parts of the peninsula, that roads paved with cut stones had been constructed from the neighboring shore to the principal cities of the interior. Each village of the Muiscas is said to have had a beaten path to Lake Guatavita, so numerous were the devotees who journeyed to the shrine there located. In Peru, the temples of Pachacama, Rimac, and other famous gods were repaired to by countless numbers from all parts of the realm, and from other provinces within a radius of 300 leagues around. Houses of entertainment were established on all the principal roads and near the temples for their accommodation, and when they made known the object of their journey, they were allowed a safe passage even through an enemy's territory. The more carefully we study history, the more important in our eyes will become the religious sense. It is almost the only faculty peculiar to man. It concerns him nearer than aught else. It is the key to his origin and destiny. As such, it merits in all its developments the most earnest attention, an attention we shall find well repaid in the clearer conceptions we thus obtain of the forces which control the actions and fates of individuals and nations. End of section 29, chapter 11, part 2. End of the Myths of the New World by Daniel Brinton. Recording by Pamela Krantz.